episode 199 of the Spokesmen Cycling Roundtable podcast. This show was recorded on Monday, 3rd of September 2018.
The Spokesmen Cycling Roundtable podcast is brought to you by Jensen USA, where you'll always find a great selection of products at amazing prices with unparalleled customer service. For more information, just go to jensenusa.com/The Spokesman. Hey everybody, it's David from the Fredcast Cycling Podcast at www.thefredcast.com. I'm one of the hosts and producers of the Spokesmen Cycling Roundtable Podcast. For show notes, links, and all sorts of other information, please visit our website at www.the-spokesmen.com. And now, here are the Spokesmen.
Hi there, I'm Carlton, Reid of Vipers.com, and today's show is a book review done by the author. And that author is John Parkin, Professor of Transport Engineering at the University of the West of England, and that's in Bristol. We talked via Skype earlier today and spent over an hour and a half examining his 228-page book, the subhead for which is International Principles and Practice. Designing for cycle traffic uses plenty of good practice from, well, where you'd expect really, the Netherlands, and is packed with information for cycle advocates, traffic engineers, I hope really that traffic engineers really use it, scholars and students. I asked John if he thought his book was utopian. Yep, he replied, but by increments, utopia can be reached, even in America or the UK. We also discussed vehicular cycling and why it's important to recognise that cycle traffic isn't necessarily slow traffic. So on the line right now, on a university line, a special polyphone, I believe, I've got John Parkin. And John, I am presuming you are at your university institution at this moment.
I am, sat at the desk with my book in front of me and notes and so on and so forth.
So tell me exactly where you are then. I know you're in Bristol, but tell everybody else where you are.
Well, I'll look out of the window because it's a glorious view. Well, apart from the fact that it's actually quite hazy today, and I can look across and see the escarpment of the, what do you call it? The Cotswolds. And it's a lovely view, and you can see the motorway and so on and so forth.
So you are at the University of the West of England, and you are the Professor of Transport Engineering.
Correct.
And I'm reading that from the back of your book, even though I knew that anyway. But so your new book is called Designing for Cycle Traffic, and it's not a cheap book, John.
It's not a cheap book. This has been pointed out to me. It is on offer at the moment with about 20% off, I think. And that is an interesting point. And I have been thinking about this quite a lot because, of course, a lot of people blog and a lot of people get what they want to get out into the world in an extremely cheap way. However, I suppose what you're paying for is... And why I went down the publishing route is that I have had every single chapter thoroughly peer-reviewed, and I think that's really important, and it really did change, and I just want to publicly acknowledge the reviewers. They contributed immensely to it, and I certainly had to make a number of changes to the chapters based on their comments. That's the first thing. And the second thing is it's that badge of authority that comes with the Institution of Civil Engineers Publishing, and the fact that then within at least my domain, which is teaching, it is a book that the libraries can adopt, and it comes with that added weight. So I think that's what you're paying for. I don't know whether I've sold that to any of the listeners any more than a blog.
It's an incredibly... dense, and that is a very much a compliment. A very dense, information-rich book, and I'll just flick through to the back of it. So it's 228 pages, including the index. Tons of further references in there. At the back, you're absolute gobbledygook to me. You've got a whole bunch of equations about designing for cycle traffic, and the Y value is this and the S value is this. And it's like, so this is something for, well, who is it for? Who is this book aimed at, John?
This book is aimed at three sorts of people: practitioners, so professional traffic engineers, highway engineers; secondly, students; thirdly, the advocacy community. And I think I had a reviewer, when you're discussing publicity with the publisher, you come up with all sorts of interesting comments about the book that you want to get across. But one of the reviewers of the book came up with the best strapline for the book. And she said it's a book for all those who think their responsibility is designing solely for motor traffic. So that says it all to me. So just coming back onto the gobbledygook, that is there principally for students. Those in the practitioner world might need to be reminded of some of these, but this is the sort of thing that I teach about capacity of equations, capacity of signal junctions, so on and so forth. Far too often, arguably, somebody who is an advocate of cycling and making changes to the network to allow more cycle traffic on the highway network might meet stiff resistance from, for example, signal engineers. So if you can't talk their language, if you don't have the ability to do the sorts of equations and have the sort of background knowledge about capacity that they have, you're simply not in a position to create an argument that will be a winning argument as far as they're concerned. So that's why that is in the back, principally for students, but also then to allow anybody to win appropriate arguments.
No, absolutely fine. And I must excuse my lack of knowledge. So that's why I said it's gobbledygook. Not to denigrate any of the information in there, of course. It's just that I'm not a traffic engineer. I'm probably fit into one of the categories you said there, which was the cycle advocacy side.
Yeah.
So let's just, I would like to go through almost page for page in the book, but let's just start with the back cover. So you've got three bits of blurb here. So the people who are on the back here, I think, are pretty indicative of who this book is for, because the people who are involved. So one, you've got Chris Boardman. So we all now know Chris Boardman. Yes, he's the gold medal Barcelona 1992. But now, to cycle advocates, he's the kind of the chief guru, because he's actually got his hands on a city, or a greater conurbation. So he's the walking and cycling commissioner of Manchester. So he's said some fantastic stuff about your book. Then you have Paul Scheppers, who's the senior road safety advisor. Scapers, I do apologise, Scapers. But he, and the reason I got that wrong is because he's Dutch. So he's from the Dutch Ministry of Infrastructure and Waterworks. And of course, that's the Rijkswaterstaat. So that's like, in effect, the Ministry of Transport, but lots of other, Ministry of Infrastructure, basically. But it's the water state infrastructure department, basically. So he's and he's a guest researcher at Utrecht University as well. So he's put a blurb on there. There are three blurbs. And then you have, I'm sure many people will be familiar with John Pucha. Am I pronouncing this correctly?
Pucha. I think it's
Pucha. Okay, John Pucha. So he's at Rutgers University, and he's been on the Spokesmen before, and he's written some amazingly fantastic cycle advocacy books, articles. He's one of the go-to guys for getting more stuff put in your town. So they're the three people on the back who are plugging this for you. So that tells you the kind of level you've got. So it's for advocates, it's for engineers, and it's probably for me, like journalists, and it's £65. And I'm not saying that as something that's a terrible thing, because it is so information rich. It's, of course, absolutely worth £65. And as you said, it can be in libraries, so lots of people can get it. Is it going to be available Kindle, online, anywhere, or is it always going to be a print book?
Yes, it is available now as an ebook. And So whatever formats that comes in, I think it's effectively PDFs of individual chapters. But to buy the whole thing, it's the same price. It's the £65.
Right. Okay. So let's go for the title first of all, because I know inside the book you do stress that it's cycle traffic, and it's really important to get those words in. So it's designing for cycle traffic. Why did you have that title? Why do you think cycle traffic as a phrase is so important?
It was about 20 years ago when I suddenly realised that people were talking about traffic and cyclists.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, hang on a minute, cyclists are traffic. And since that time, I have insisted on always talking about cycle traffic. I think it's becoming more and more common. I get the feeling that people understand it. I get the feeling that there's a recognition of the meaning behind that. And as I say, I sort of go dip into a bit of philosophy there. The way we think is utterly informed by the way we speak and the language we use. So if we're using the wrong language, then we're fundamentally adopting the wrong thinking. So, just as a for instance, in Germany and Denmark and the Netherlands, they have used, the correct expression, the equivalent. I'm just trying to look it up. Here we go. Fietsverkeer in Dutch is
Radverkeer and cycle traffic in Danish. So that's very.
So here's the thing. They've been using the right language, and also they've been doing the right things. I think there's a fundamentally important connection there.
And the language is also important, of course, and this is very important for a lot of bicycle advocates in the way that the media talks about the agency of cars, in that we have driverless cars on the roads at the moment. If you looked at what the media talks about, so it's a car smashes into a pedestrian. It's not a motorist smashing into a pedestrian, whereas the point you make in the book is you're still searching for a headline, bicycle kills pedestrian. So the agency is removed when it's a motorist, but it is not when it's a cyclist. So is that an intrinsic fault in society that somehow we've got to correct?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think we correct it again through an insistence on the appropriate language. So it's how we think is informed by the language we use. And I think I'm no philosopher really, but I think that the longer we perpetuate inappropriate language, the longer we perpetuate inappropriate thinking. So let's begin to get the language right. And if the advocacy community, if ourselves as academics teaching students use the correct language, if the professionals begin to use the correct language, we will begin to think about this whole thing of cyclists within the public realm and cyclists on the carriageway and cyclists within the transport network in a completely different way. And I think that is so fundamentally important. So arguably, I would say that page 2, that section 1.2.2 about language and its connotations is fundamentally important to the whole book, the whole kind of thinking of the book, and the whole way in which it began to go wrong for cycling and design for cycle traffic, years ago.
Yeah, I agree, and I've devoted large chunks of my books to getting those definitions down, including, because you've mentioned one of the people I've mentioned in my book before, who's very much a forgotten person in cycle advocacy. I've tried to resurrect him, and that's Eric Claxton, who his terminology was for cycleway. So when we're talking about this is where it comes confusing: a bike path, a cycle path, a cycle track. Why do you describe these things in this way? And language is important. Well, he just said, look, we've got a motorway, we should have a cycle way. Now, you say in your book that you probably prefer that term, but you can't always use it, apart from chapter 7, I think you say, because it's not the official language. So just tell us a bit about why that's important.
a call out to you first, Carlton. Thank you for your book, because that's where I think I probably knew years ago, but you re-alerted me to Eric Claxton's use of cycleway. Just tell us the title of your book, your latest one. I can't quite remember.
The latest one is Bike Boom. I
Bike Boom.
probably also mentioned it. In fact, I did mention it in Rosemont Built for Cars too. So I do regard him as a seminal figure.
Yeah, I think you're right. And then I had quite a struggle, actually. When I first wrote the book, I decided that cycleways and Eric Claxton was an interesting historical sort of anachronism, and he nearly got it right. But then I kind of thought, and this was me being too conventional again, arguably, I thought, well, we can't use that. We've got to use the word cycle track. Then I came to write I couldn't get the title correct for Chapter 7. I was doing kind of linguistic gymnastics to try and work out what the appropriate title was, sort of off-road cycle, and all the rest of it. And I thought, oh no, the correct title is Cycleway, obviously. So that's what then became the title chapter, and then I've got a bit of blurb at the beginning of Chapter 7 all about that. So here's the thing. Why do we, and again, it comes back to the language, path. Actually, if you go into its etymology, is a word entirely linked with the foot. It's about the
padding down of dirt.
Padding down, exactly right. And if we use that in association with cycling, we immediately have that link between pedestrians and cyclists. Then you sort of got this sort of commonality. We end up with all these other terms like greenway and shared use and all the rest of it. I will say, no names, no pack drill. I've had some very interesting discussions fairly recently with some very senior people who have argued for still the use of shared use paths, greenways, and so on and so forth, on the basis that that's all we're going to be able to get. And I really believe that we are beyond that now in the UK. I think we have these extremely good examples from Northern Europe where we can move beyond shared use paths where the actual design parameters are, according to the principles which we'll get onto, I'm sure, are not adequate for cycle traffic. Because you are having to cycle at a slower speed. And I know, for example, and this could be unpopular, and I need to be careful how I say it, but the chief exec of Sustrans and the director of Cycling UK joined together to plead with people to slow down on the Bristol-Bath path. And they were saying your behaviour needs to be moderated for the benefit of all. And my argument is, actually, the Bristol-Bath path, if those pleadings are having to be made, is not now fit for purpose for cycle traffic, because it's not providing the level of service that many people on that route would like to adopt. So mixing pedestrians and cyclists is innately a problem. I'm sort of going on to a slightly different issue here, but these are reasons for, therefore, not using greenway, shared use, shared paths, and so on and so forth. What is appropriate is, as Claxton said, the equivalence between a way for carriages, motor traffic, a way for cyclists, a way for the footway, carriageway, cycleway. So that's why I adopt it, and I think we should. Again, seriously think about using cycleway much more frequently. Where that cycleway is not a legal right-of-way, it can be just called a cycleway. Where it also happens to be a legal right-of-way, then it will also be, in legal definition terms, it will be called a cycle track as well. So it'll be one and the same thing.
Now, is there any chance that officially these terms could ever be changed, or are we stuck with them, do you think?
I suspect in the near term we are stuck with them. I don't think that now let me think, when did the term sort of cycle track first appear? It was sort of the 1930s. I think the value would be in initially bringing them into common use, and then I think it might be a natural and obvious thing later on to make some legal change, but I can't see a legal change happening in the foreseeable future.
So
I'm not necessarily sure that's absolutely necessary. I think it's the common use of the term that's more important.
So we should be using the word cycleway just in natural language much more than we do.
I would argue that, yeah.
And I would too. Now, cycleway is a good term. London cycle superhighway is a bit of a mouthful. So do you think they made a bit of a mistake there in naming something when they could have just called it the London Cycleway? Why do they have to go and make it into something super and make it so much longer so then it has to be abbreviated to CSH?
Yeah, good point. To be honest, I'd avoided... to be honest, I'm not sure I particularly thought about that point, other than when I was writing the bibliography, the sort of, what do you call it, the list of abbreviations and definitions at the beginning. That became an enormous task. You begin to realise how many different terms are used. But I think, in a secondary sense, I was avoiding being too critical of London on the basis that it has been doing good things. It's been learning a lot and doing things better and better as time has gone on, generally speaking.
So perhaps in the fullness of time, they could just drop the cycle superhighway bit and just call it a cycleway.
I would think. I would think so. Yeah. Ironically, the Danes have now adopted superhighway as a phrase as well.
Is that for their fast ones? So there's a differentiation, like in the Netherlands, there are some fast routes, like almost like motorway style routes compared to.
Yeah, they are. That's exactly right. That's in Denmark, and in Netherlands they use the word snelfiets, which is fast route.
Fast route, yeah.
Interestingly, though, of course, there is a backlash even in the Netherlands against some of those routes that are being called snelfiets on the basis that people somehow have a general fear of cyclists going quickly, whereas the inverse is true with motor traffic, and people seem to object when we need, for very good safety reasons, to constrain the speed of motor traffic. I think there's sort of an irony there. So even in the Netherlands, there are objections to snelfiets, and I do wonder whether that snelfiets is the correct terminology.
So picking up on that point, the mass media will complain when a pedestrian is knocked over by a cyclist who was screaming along at 18 miles an hour. And it's like, yeah, but that's 2 miles an hour than 20, which is something that you decry in your same pages, saying that, you can't, how can you possibly go at 20 miles an hour in a car? It's too slow. So there's the double standard at work there, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. You put the finger on the nail, or whatever the expression is. Hit the nail on the head. Yeah. So
let's go back to, I'm not going to pick out every single phrase in your book. We'll be here for 25 hours. But cycle track. So cycle track, it is very much a bugbear of mine, because, as you pointed out, it was first used in the 1930s. It was the definition that the Ministry of Transport used for these new Dutch-style cycleways. I always use cycleways when I'm talking about them, but then when I have to talk in their language, I've got to retranslate back and start talking about cycle tracks. And one of the reasons it's my bugbear is because when I have to search through literature of the time, when I have to search through newspapers, and I put in the keywords cycle track, of course I get 90% velodromes and grass cycle racing tracks. And it has that obvious connotation of not being for transport. This is a recreational leisure thing. So if you only we could have searched for cycleway was used in the 1920s and 1930s. It's a phrase you can search for, and you can go for people finding to use it way before Claxton. But it just never caught on, and unfortunately cycle track caught on. And it is amazing that, and I don't actually think I really mentioned this at all, but the fact that it was created in the 1930s as this definition, and we still have it today, this definition, and it is absolutely an imperfect definition when we have got this much, much better word.
It is. No, you're absolutely right. And I just thinking off the top of my head, it would need scholars of history to confirm this, but I do wonder whether the term cycle track was adopted because there was this perception, because it was linked with the interurban network and trunk roads and so on and so forth. the kind of link back to, the high wheelers and the people doing it for sport and all of that sort of thing. So there's this very strong sense that cycling was something to do with leisure and sport and not to do with transport.
No, I would say it's actually the opposite. So you look through the Ministry of Transport minutes of the time, the mandarins writing to the ministers and stuff. It was absolutely for traffic. It was the separation of traffic. So they wanted to clearly corral cyclists away from their betters, in effect. So the elites in their cars, and they wanted to ostensibly save cyclists' lives by separating them out. But you don't have to read between the lines too much, and you certainly find it from many, many newspaper reports at the time, is no, this is so we can drive faster. That's why they want cyclists to be put to one side and separated. So let's go through. I mean, it would be tough to go through every single chapter and give a description, but if we can just how many chapters have we got? Let's have a look. We've got 15 chapters.
Yeah.
So if we just if you give me a brief overview, so this is like this is yourself giving yourself a book review, basically.
Yeah.
And you're describing each chapter as we go along. So introduction, well, we've covered a lot of that. So a lot of that's to do with the language and just what this is. And one of the points you make at the beginning is we should be designing for people. Basically. So let's start on chapter 2. So planning for cycle traffic. What's that all about?
And I think, again, this is a critically important issue. Go back 10, 15 years. I just don't think that there was any level of transport planning undertaken for cycle traffic. The only sort of consideration given to cyclists was within the pre-existing road network. There were often issues with safety, and therefore the whole issue of dealing with traffic became an issue of dealing with, collision black spots or whatever. However, in transport planning more generally, we do an awful lot of planning. So in other words, we work out where origins are, where destinations are, what the demand will be like, what the shape of the network ought to be, for public transport, what the pricing will be, and so on and so forth. And we model that. We model the demand and so on and so forth. And it is critically important, therefore, for the mode of cycling that a whole panoply of appropriate planning is undertaken. Now, this book is principally about designing for cycle traffic, but it's certainly incumbent on me not to, and it's quite a large chapter 2, it's certainly incumbent on me to describe to the readership the appropriate ways of planning for cycle traffic. So it starts with policy, it then moves through to sort of understanding the legal basis, it moves on to estimating demand, and there are some really good developments in the methodologies for estimating demand. For example, Robin Lovelace's work at Leeds on propensity to cycle tool, and an add-on to that, a cycle infrastructure planning tool, which is now available, and then the whole issue of cost, the analysis of costs and benefits, and so on and so forth, and finally then the monitoring and the evaluation of schemes. So those are exactly the titles for the different types of planning that go on for most other forms of transport, and therefore they ought to take place for cycle traffic, and they are increasingly, and that is really very welcome and very, very good to know.
Now many cycle advocates are absolutely very good at the engineering part of what's in your book, but I would say that the estimating future cycling demand and then the cost benefit appraisal, they're two incredibly key items for an advocate. So you've got to talk about how much this is going to cost, because these are things that people want to know, and then how much is it going to be used. So these are two totally core things which we've got to nail down. Yeah.
And I provide in there the current web tag, which is the government web-based transport appraisal guidance for modelling cycle demand, and you can go on the web and you can find the appropriate source document for that. But what I do in a box then is, again, put numbers to that and show people how the equation works and how you could estimate that demand. And then, of course, beyond that now, and I think to some extent the web tag will, or a future iteration of web tag will include Robin Lovelace's propensity to cycle tool. And of course, anybody can go online and use that. And I sort of very briefly explain some of what the propensity to cycle tool is doing there.
Now, one of the things about the cost-benefit analysis is that the government seems to ignore it on a pretty every single time basis. So you can talk about the cost-benefit analysis or the benefits of a cycle scheme compared to a road scheme. Yet when it comes to but what was actually built, it was the road scheme. So why does the government ignore its own figures?
Well, that's a very good question. I think it's the kind of fairly well-known idea that those, and I would include my profession as well, those within the professions and those within policymakers and politicians want big ticket items because then they can retire and say, I built that, iconic bridge or whatever it is. There's an element of that. And I think equally that there's, the opposite is the case with cycling. It will often be relatively smaller scale adaptations of the built environment which create the appropriate environment for cycle traffic. So you haven't got the same sort of level of, desire by the politicians. In terms of the actual numbers, the health benefits from cycling are enormous, and as a consequence of that, sometimes they're simply, haven't been anyway, believed, as it were. So you come out with these rather high benefit to cost ratios, and then the policymakers say, well, they can't be true, and then ignore them, and then still want to build a road scheme, as it were. However, here's the point, and I do make it in the book, I think, if I could find the right sentence. For me, I had a startling revelation, and I thought, well, hang on a minute. Why is the burden of the benefit of the health benefit of cycling, as it were, placed on cycling? In other words, why is it that that has to be calculated as a benefit? In other words, the norm is driving in a motor car and being sedentary. What would the whole investment scenario look like if, conversely, we place the burden of health on motor traffic and its detrimental effect on health had to be estimated in relation to the motor traffic itself, and the cycle traffic was assumed to be a norm? And I think you would get enormously larger disbenefits then from promoting motor traffic schemes, and you wouldn't even have to consider benefits for cycling. Then it would just be the transport efficiency benefits that you would be gaining.
Okay, let's go chapter by chapter again. So chapter 3, Principles of Design for Cycle Traffic. What's that all about, John? Okay.
I think this is arguably, again, a key. I think chapters 2 and chapter 3 are sort of absolutely key chapters. I, again, have been a bit radical, I think, in the sense that historically many have talked about different types of cyclists. Fast commuters, parent with child, and so on and so forth. I think that is wrong. I'll explain why I think that's wrong in a moment. But I do think it's important to reckon different types of cycle, which haven't been recognised before. And there are many: tandems, quadricycles, hand cycles, cycles with child seats, cargo cycles, and so on and so forth. So in other words, we need to understand the nature, shape and geometry of those vehicles, because it is the built environment that we will be creating a geometry for the built environment to accommodate those heterogeneous different types of cycle. However, for the cyclists themselves, there certainly are. I mean, we are, as humans, extremely different. We're sometimes disabled, sometimes older, sometimes younger. But the key issue for designing for any type of highway or traffic engineering sort of function is the design speed. It's the speed at which you cycle, and that determines the horizontal geometry, the vertical geometry, the stopping sight distances, and so on and so forth. that is embedded in Dutch design. It always has been. They adopt 30 kilometres per hour for urban as the urban design speed and 40 kilometres per hour for the interurban design speed. And I tabulate in the book a range of different design speeds. But fundamentally, the basic design speed for cycle traffic is 30 kilometres per hour. That to many seems quite high. But the mean speed from studies I've done of commute cyclists in Leeds, which is not exactly the flattest city in the UK, suggests that the mean speed is 20 kilometres per hour. So then with a standard deviation of whatever it was, six I think it was, kilometres per hour, you will get a good number of cyclists, particularly going downhill, who are travelling at significantly more than 20 kilometres per hour. Therefore, you need to design your infrastructure to suit that range of speed. And I think just as a sort of passing comment then, that 20 kilometres per hour is significantly higher, is 5 times higher than the mean speed of walking. So that fundamentally is the point why we should, and I will express it extremely categorically, never ever design for cycle traffic shared with pedestrian traffic. It just does not work because it doesn't offer the appropriate level of service for either pedestrians or for cyclists.
Oil and water. Electric bikes, where do they fit into that speed? Because and speed pedelecs even, so the ones that can go even faster than normal e-bikes.
I think the speed pedelecs, I think when you get above a certain speed, I think the jury's out on this. Then there would certainly be a case for registration and not allowing them, on certain cycleways and so on and so forth. However, I think with standard e-bikes where the power cuts out at 50 miles an hour, your maximum speed will typically not be that much higher than for non-e-bikes. The principal advantage of e-bikes is that you can travel further and tire less on that longer journey, and also going uphill you can travel at more nearly your normal mean speed rather than cycling more slowly. So overall, I think the issues of e-bikes and their speed are rather over-egged. However, I do think the jury is still out on that issue to some extent. There's certainly evidence from the Netherlands, for example, that older people on e-bikes are having more collisions. But I think that is an awful lot to do with the locomotive function of the older people and the fact that they are not able to control the bike as well as they might be able to. And I think there's some special issues there that certainly do need some consideration. But in terms of e-bike speed relative to design speed for normal cycle, I don't think there's that much difference, but we still need to keep an eye on that. I think we will learn more as time goes on about that.
Okay, and I can see from your index, and I do like books with indexes, that there are 5 mentions of e-bikes in the book. So you've clearly covered it in a number of different chapters. Yeah. Okay, let's chapter 4, which I like this one, reducing motor traffic dominance.
Okay, just before we go into that, can I just make a real point that I hope I have, and I will certainly accept any comment or criticism that I haven't done this well enough, really pushed on the whole issue of cycling for all. In other words, people who are disabled, and broadly speaking, about a quarter of the population has some sort of disability, whether that's mental, physical, whether it's just about, it's an important issue, whether people tire quickly or whatever it may be. And if we are designing only for a proportion of the population which is not disabled, then we're being extremely discriminatory. So throughout the book, the word I have used, and I don't know, you've kind of identified, is a cycle, because a cycle is something which is pedalled along, and then a bicycle is a particular type of cycle. So in every case, we're thinking about cycles and all people. And I think that's a critically important point to make.
In a lot of the photographs in the book, you've actually got a recumbent rider. Is that somebody you were going out with, or the photographer was going out with, or was that just an accidental recumbent rider?
I have always been deliberate in trying to include as many different types of cycle as I can in my serendipitous photography, as it were. However, I did go out specifically with Kevin Hickman and Alex Ingram from Wheels for Wellbeing to ensure that my balance of photographs was not inappropriate.
I can now see that, Kevin. I do know Kevin. Do you know why I didn't recognise him? He wasn't on a Brompton.
Okay.
I always see him on his Brompton. So there you go. He's on his recumbent there. Okay. Yep, I see that's Kevin now. Okay, cycling for all, very, very good point. And there are lots of photographs in the book, and not just in, say, a specific chapter on disability where people are cycling for all. Okay, so chapter 4, reducing motor traffic dominance.
Yeah. And I've had comment already that it's really important that this chapter is there. Hang on, sorry. Can I just drag you back to chapter 3 again? I just want to make a really important point, I think. And that is about the nature of networks in urban areas. Fundamentally, what's happened is that we had a pre-existing sort of highway network in 1950, 58, let's say. And then throughout the 1960s, we very dramatically changed the nature of our cities and urban areas by re-engineering that network, adding new roads, bypasses, interurban distributors and so on and so forth, and managing that traffic on an area-wide basis using signing and signals and so on and so forth to suit, and this is a key point, to suit motor traffic, which very often was in fact to the detriment of cycle traffic. So whereas, historically you might have been able to cycle straight into town on a certain arterial route for very good reason. There's been a pedestrianised area and then an inner urban ring road, and the motor traffic has to go around that inner urban distributor road or whatever. Cycle traffic has had to do that as well, but it's all been designed for motor traffic. And I think there's a key issue about retrofitting to create filter permeability within our urban areas to enhance the attractiveness and prospects for cycle traffic in penetrating to the centre of urban areas. We've got to go back and re-engineer all of our area-wide traffic management, and that is beginning to happen. You'll see gyrators being taken out in London and so on and so forth. And
Leicester's a good case in point. They had multi-deck highways came down and that kind of stuff. So it is happening.
Which was my hometown, and I remember the Belgrave Road flyer being built in 1973, and so it was very interesting to see it taken down a couple of years ago. Yeah.
So that's the Curry Mile in Leicester, isn't it? So
indeed, yeah, it leads on to the Curry Mile.
Much more attractive now. Okay, so let's get on to that chapter 4, which we're trying constantly to get onto. So get onto it.
Yeah. Okay. And I think the point is, and many in the advocacy community at least are recognising this. I'm not entirely sure how well recognised it is within the professional community yet, though it certainly is a growing recognition that our town and city centres are for people. And fundamentally, and I got a quote near the beginning of it, cities are for people, I say, and the fabric of community should be designed principally for people. And certainly there are many cities now that are creating areas within both residential and the city centre which are for people, and those people include people cycling. Therefore, a critical issue is reducing, as the chapter title suggests, the dominance of motor traffic, and it's about all of those different methodologies for doing that, including area-wide traffic calming, including creating specific infrastructure like cycle streets for cycle traffic, including shared space, pedestrian priority, informal streets and traffic calming and so on and so forth.
And it is one of the ways to reduce motor traffic dominance also getting this book, your book, into the hands of current engineers. That they can just there's now something quite concrete in a figurative sense to use that's very academic, clearly looks weighty. The fact that it's £65 is probably a benefit in this respect, in that it's something incredibly serious. Cycle traffic is serious. This is something that it's not a flippant thing, which is probably something that you certainly see in the literature in the 60s, 70s, 80s. This is a flippant thing. This is not a real transport. This is just a side issue. This book is bringing it into something much more serious.
I think that's right. Thank you for saying that. I think that's exactly right. I was approached to write the book, and I had previously always suggested that I would only write a book on traffic engineering generally, including all modes, buses and motor traffic and motorcycles and everything. However, I think you're right, and I think it is I would argue it's an extremely timely book because two reasons. There have been significant developments taking place in thinking over recent years, particularly in London, and now we will see more of that in Manchester. And just to call out here to those very innovative engineers that are working in the field, do I need to re-record that with the dog bark in the background? Or
No, I think people who listen to this podcast often get that dog barking in the background now. It's something I can't really help. It's our guide dog puppy, so sometimes she will bark, and I'm sure people will just accept that. I hope.
That's I'm sure they will. So, where was I? Yeah, significant, and call out to people like Phil Jones, Brian Deegan, Adrian Lord. These are the people who have been pushing the boundaries and creating those significant developments. I've just named three there, but there are many more. Apologies to those who I haven't named.
But Brian is somebody who's read the whole book. I mean, you say in the beginning that the Brian is the guy who really helped do the whole book.
Indeed, he has. So thank you to Brian for doing that again. Yeah, great, brilliant. And then I think, secondly, there's been a lot of development and design guidance over recent years as well. So I think it's timely because it really is important then to consolidate that, to evaluate that, a kind of line in the sand, as it were, to kind of say, well, this is where we are now at. This is a serious subject. These are the developments that have taken place. This is the guidance as it currently stands. But then importantly, and you may or may not be, my potential readers may be shocked to realise, but my copy of the book now has many marginal notes about issues that I would reconsider for the second edition. But so there's a line in the sand, but certainly, things will develop from there.
Mm-hmm. So then we get on to some shorter chapters, because you're talking about very specific things. So let's go through these. So cycle traffic within the carriageway, what's that about?
Okay, so traditionally, traffic engineers, if they've had an issue with cycle traffic, have painted a bit of a white line and suggested that the problem is solved. We now know, I think this is still sort of, again, open to further development and so on and so forth, but broadly speaking, if motor traffic is at 20 miles an hour and the volume of traffic is about 2,000 vehicles per day, then it's a very benign environment for cycle traffic. Higher speeds than that, or higher volumes than that, and you begin to need to separate cycle traffic from motor traffic. So this book, within the carriageway, it's talking about no provision at all, cycle lanes, and then light segregation. So that's cycle lanes with some sort of vertical intermittent barriers between the lane which is for motor traffic and the lane which is for cycle traffic. A critical issue in all of this is a recognition that the bicycle is not wafer thin, that it has what we in engineering terms call a kinematic envelope. In other words, when in motion, the width of the cycle, because of side-to-side motion and so on and so forth, is wider than the absolute width of the handlebar. So that determines the width that you need. So very much the chapter's about the widths that you need to provide within the carriageway and whether or not you need to segregate to some extent by light segregation within the carriageway.
On that note, two things. One, I got Chris Boardman to talk about that envelope on the overtaking video that I did some years ago, which has been very, very popular on YouTube. So it's very good if you want to hear about envelope and the passing distance. And Chris does that very, very well. And
Brilliant.
Secondly, the way you're talking about the light segregation and in effect the painted white line, which is the bugbear of many cyclists. I've now since historically found where that's come from. So it was a Ministry of Transport traffic professor, in fact, and probably somebody very, very similar to yourself, in fact, in academic background, who advocated for this in about 1940, 1941. So he created a treatise for the Ministry of Transport. It was then picked up by the Cyclists Touring Club and other parts of official cycling as the preferred method. So instead of cycle tracks, which were coming at this time, which were segregated with demarcated 9-foot wide curbs, it was their preferred option, which was what they were pushing to get. Was no, just make the road wider and have in effect a painted white line. So we can now date that. I've now found the professor who came out with this in the early 1940s.
I'd be interested in that. Yeah. Is that available on your website at all?
I haven't. I've got the research. I haven't published it anywhere yet. This is the 1930 cycle tracks research. That's where it's coming in. But it's an interesting little snippets which it will get out there. I will publish that at some point, of just where cycling has come from and how certainly how the CTC is back then, Cyclist Touring Club, and cycling whatever, what are they called now, cycling today, cycling whatever,
Cycling UK.
Yeah, I'm being quite flippant there because it is quite hard to actually pin them down with a quite a vacuous name that they do unfortunately have now, which I'm sure they'll hate me for. But there you go.
Well, I think I want to take a contrary view to that. I think Cycling UK is a rather useful summarising catch-all phrase that really, to me, tells me what they are about. Cyclist Touring Club is a much more specific title, which doesn't really tell you what they're all about. So I go with Cycling UK.
I know the arguments, and I guess I'm very much biased because of the long history of the Cyclist Touring Club. I know that the touring part is for but that's why I use CTC. You can use the AA and not have to use Automobile Association. Know what AA means.
Okay, yeah. Okay, yeah.
You don't need the touring bit, basically. You just say CTC without the connotations then. But anyway, we're drifting away from what we should be talking about.
We are.
So that was cycle traffic within the carriageway. That's chapter 5. Cycle traffic adjacent to the carriageway is chapter 6.
Yeah, okay. So I have the boundary, as it were, between chapter 5 and chapter 6 is, as it were, the curb line. So chapter 5, as we said, deals with within the carriageway, and that includes light segregation. But then as soon as you put a curb line or some sort of barrier, vertical or otherwise, between the carriageway and cycle traffic, which is still within the highway, the curtilage of the whole highway, then that is dealt with in chapter 6. And that includes so-called stepped cycle tracks, which are the type of track that has been used in Copenhagen for many, many years. We first in the UK began to call them hybrid tracks. That's referenced in a local transport note or traffic advisory leaflet. But now the phrase which is more commonly used is stepped cycle track. So you get a curb, excuse me, you get a curb between the carriageway and the stepped cycle track, and then a curb between the stepped cycle track and the adjacent footway. Those are one form of separation from the carriageway, and then another form is where you have some sort of more a greater distance. So you might have a half a metre and then a cycle track, which is then, well, very often it looks as though it's still within the footway, but the critically important point is that that cycle track will be designed to all the geometric standards and comfort standards for the surface of the route and so on and so forth, which are appropriate for cycle traffic. The footway is something completely different. And historically, of course, what we've done is, as it were, thrown cycle traffic onto the footway and then done nothing for cycle traffic other than assume that it can wend its way in and along the footway and around pedestrians to get to its destination. So what we're saying now is that the provision for cycle traffic needs to be within a cycle track which is designed specifically for cycle traffic, and that's the key distinction.
Where does, I'm going to describe something here that you'll know full well is a red rag to a bull, but vehicular cycling. So if there is any full-blooded 100%, all cyclists must take up the full width of the lane and must never go on separated cycle infrastructure, etc. Where does vehicular cycling fit into your book, if at all?
Now, that's an interesting point. It doesn't, in the sense that, let's define vehicular cycling.
Yes.
That is from John Forrester and his notion that cyclists ought to be able to perform within motor traffic in such a way that they are treated by other motor traffic as vehicles. And my suggestion is that the evidence is that there are many people, you will not get mass cycling if you adopt that philosophy, because many people simply do not want to perform in that sort of way, in the sense that they would need to, for example, accelerate extremely quickly at roundabouts to get up to the sort of speed that motor traffic will be going around a circulating carriageway and so on and so forth. They either physically are not capable of doing it or simply do not want to do it. And then there is also the proximity to fast-moving traffic. So it's a philosophy that may be fine for some people, but will not engender mass cycling. Now, I think some could begin to confuse what I'm talking about with vehicular cycling, because a mantra, and my comment is that this should be etched on the desk of every designer involved in designing for cycle traffic. My point is that the bicycle is a vehicle, and it's a vehicle capable of speed. And a heck of a lot of highway and traffic engineering follows from that. It means that we have to, as I said before, get the right radii and so on and so forth. But that is different than saying that that bicycle as a vehicle has also to mix with motor traffic, because I think it can in some circumstances, where the speeds are right, the volumes are right, and so on and so forth. And in more extreme cases, it can as well, where people are willing to be amongst faster moving traffic. And I count myself as one of those. I'm a fairly confident cyclist, and I will command my position in the lane and so on and so forth. But I recognise that not everybody is wanting or willing to do that. But equally, the bicycle is a vehicle, and therefore all of the design off the road needs to be to the appropriate vehicular standards for a bicycle.
So I'm now going to channel my not 1970s, 1980s vehicular cyclists. I'm going to channel the 1930s. This is where it came from, the 1930s CTC guys, who... So basically, the arguments for and against are just regurgitated constantly. But where they started in the 1930s, so the arguments against segregation back then, one of the arguments, there were many, one of them was, well, yes, fantastic, we're going to get 500 miles of segregated lanes put in. However, that's just 1% of actually how many roads are out there, and it's going to take, actually, if we start the calculations, it's going to take 1,500 years to get, even if the money was available, to get all of these cycle tracks put in next to roads. In other words, it's utopia. So is your book a utopia? So you're talking about putting a lot of this infrastructure in, the separation or the correct terminology, etc. All fantastic in theory, and with cycle advocates would like to talk about this. Is it ever actually going to happen? Is it not just you're talking about utopia and it's going to take 1,500 years to put in?
Okay, that's a brilliant journalist question. I'll tell you why, because I'm damned if I say yes and I'm damned if I say no. So you've nailed me there. So I'm going to go and say yes, it is a utopia, but it is a utopia that we should certainly be aiming at. And I think that it's about progression. I think that, that there is this thing about thinking about the ultimate, and if the guys who started building, let's say, the railway network for the UK actually had any conception about its nature and extent when they began, they might have sat down and scratched their heads and begun to think that was impossible, and they wouldn't have then gone and done it, if you see what I'm driving at.
No, it's a very good point. So Stockton to Darlington Railway, if you start with that, well, that's nothing. We're never going to get any railways in this country. And then you look at it just 20 years afterwards, the amazing explosion. So these things are possible. So utopia is actually achievable if that's what you want to do.
Exactly right. And I think it's that sort of success breeds success. So just as, for instance, Chris Boardman and his extensive team of technical advisors in Manchester are being now even more, I think, what's the word, adventurous, let's say, than has been the case in London. They're doing it slightly different, but they wouldn't be doing it in Manchester now if it hadn't already been done in London. So there's a sort of looking over the shoulder and looking at that success, and then all of a sudden you look around and every major city in the UK will have pretty damn good cycle, infrastructure in 15, 20 years time, sort of thing. And then, that will spill out to other areas. So, yeah, I would say I think I am aiming at utopia. And you can look to the Netherlands, and it's, everybody suggests that's cycling utopia. Having said that, I mean, if you went to the Netherlands in the 1990s and then compared that now with what they have currently, it is so much better now than it was in the 1990s, that they have developed enormously as well, even in that period. So nothing static, and I think your reference point is always the current time. But if you look too far ahead, then you can begin to say, well, it's all impossible. But it's all about that trajectory.
Incremental steps.
Exactly.
Okay, so one of my favourite chapter, just because of what it's called, Chapter 7, Cycleways, which we have discussed briefly already, but what is that chapter about?
Yeah. Okay, this chapter talks about some of that legal background that we've talked about already, and then the principles for the design, the geometry is laid out in earlier sections, but then I talk about the pavement, the highway pavement, the surfacing and construction details, and then lighting and so on and so forth. So this is slightly more the civil engineering. I think the civil engineering for the highway is fairly straightforward, but then very often when you move off the highway completely, you end up with, and again, this is a mantra that is now much more widely adopted. Historically, anything off carriageway, the asphalt surface would often have been laid by hand. In other words, it would have been tamped down by hand without machine rollers and so on and so forth. It is generally ubiquitously recognised now that you need to lay the surface with a machine so that you get the same tolerances in terms of deviations from the line and level that you're after. You get the same tolerances as on the highway, and you need that because, again, the vehicle is the bicycle is a vehicle capable of speed, and therefore you feel that if you're cycling along at any speed. So I think it's still a fair bit of learning needs to go on there on the part of professionals involved in designing off-road cycle routes.
Okay, so chapter 8, and again, this is another, there's many critical chapters in your book. Every single chapter, of course, is a critical one. But chapter 8, Priority Junctions, is an interesting one because you can make the most fantastic protected straight cycleway. But as they recognised in the 1930s, it falls to pieces if you don't protect the junction. So it's the junction that's actually the important part. So chapter 8 is Priority Junctions.
Yeah,
what's that about?
And of course, there are more priority junctions than any other junction type, just because, there are thousands of them, innumerable almost. And we, again, have been learning a lot. I think the Danish have been very good at this. Their step cycle tracks, they carry straight across the junction mouth. Now in London, we are adopting many more mouths to junctions where the footway continues across the junction mouth, and the motor traffic has to be a lot more careful about how it emerges onto the main road. That's fine where the side roads are very minor in nature. Where the side roads are more major in nature, then you will begin to move up the pecking order and either put signals in or roundabouts. But mostly it will be about more minor junctions. So I think the jury's still out there. I think we have still a lot to learn, and I'm expressing the current state of the art. But if anything, it is in this area where I think there's most continuing development in thinking about how we safely cross pedestrians and cyclists across the mouths of priority junctions.
Now, sorry, go for it, John. What?
Yeah, what I will just say, I think critically important. I kind of, this was a realization to me as well. On the a trunk route between Arnhem and Nijmegen in the Netherlands, there is a priority junction on the track, and there's a photograph of that in the book, figure 8.1.4. And my point about that is there are warning lines, there's the give way line, there's signing, and so on and so forth. And I'll just quote you what it says. The full usual traffic engineering specification of control, warning, and guidance is provided. So even on the completely segregated from motor traffic, they are using the full panoply of normal traffic engineering specification to create their junctions. And I think that's an important point, that off-highway, we've still got to design for traffic, because it is traffic, it's behaving as traffic.
So that is one of those Schnell routes you were talking about, because I've been on that route.
Yeah.
It is fabulous. Now, we are only halfway through going through the chapters of your book here, John. So we are now going to cut to an advertising break and take it away, David.
Hey, Carlton, thanks so much. And hi, everybody, it's David. And I am here, well, you know why I'm here. I'm here to talk about our longtime loyal and fantastic sponsor, Jensen USA, at jensenusa.com/the spokesman. Remember, that's JENSON USA.com. Now, what's Jensen USA? Well, if you don't know by now, you should. JensenUSA.com is the place where you're going to find all of the things that you need for your complete cycling lifestyle. Complete bikes, mountain bikes, road bikes, gravel grinders, everything in between, components, apparel, accessory, tools, shoes, really gifts, everything you can imagine that you would need for your cycling lifestyle. And we're not talking about off-branded stuff. We are talking about name brands that you know, love, and need for your cycling lifestyle. You're going to find those name brands at incredible low prices, and that's all going to be coupled with unparalleled customer service. If you haven't been to Jensen USA before, I urge you to do it right now and every time you need something for cycling, because they're going to have it at great prices, and you're going to be very, very satisfied with their customer service. Go ahead and check them out. That's at jensenusa.com/The Spokesman. Our thanks to Jensen USA for supporting the Spokesman Cycling Roundtable podcast, and our thanks to you for supporting our sponsor, Jensen USA. All right, Carlton, back to you.
Thanks, David. And I am here with Professor John Parkin, and we are going through his book chapter by chapter. So we've just done, before the ad break, we had priority junctions. We've now got chapter 9, signal control. So traffic lights, red and green bicycles, I'm presuming, John, in this chapter.
Yep, that's exactly right. Now, signal control is the traffic engineer's favourite default sort of option for more major junctions. They're more efficient than roundabouts. And broadly speaking, the speeds will be a little lower going through traffic signal control junctions than on the rest of the road network because traffic will have been brought to a halt because of the red light and so on and so forth. However, there are many, many different, very specific ways that we need to ensure that we cater for cycle traffic, either crossing on cycle routes or if they are on cycle tracks or step cycle tracks or even in cycle lanes approaching, different specific engineering methods for dealing with their presence. And that's what the chapter deals with.
And then, I mean, that's just stopping people, with lights. This next one is certainly something that's a favourite of cycle advocates, and that's roundabouts, especially Dutch-style protected roundabouts, which you do. So the way you describe it in here is roundabouts with external cycle tracks, which I'm assuming is your definition of the Dutch cycle roundabouts. Yes.
Now you've fallen into a trap. Most UK people talk about Dutch-style roundabouts, but there is no such thing as a Dutch-style roundabout. It's a kind of catch-all for. They've got lots of different styles of roundabouts. Which style do you mean? So fundamentally, I think the style that people are referring to is a roundabout where there is an external track that cycle traffic goes around the outside of the roundabout, and then either, and both exist in the Netherlands, either the cycle traffic gives way at each entry and exit arm, or the motor traffic gives way to the cycle traffic. And broadly speaking, in urban areas, the cycle traffic has priority, and in rural areas, the motor traffic has priority simply because of the relative speed. But fundamentally, I think it's one of those empire things. It's one of those things that we exported to certain countries around the world, the English-style roundabout. And I compare and contrast English roundabout geometry with so-called compact roundabout geometry. And compact geometry is typically the continental style of roundabout geometry. And in effect, the difference is this, that the English-style roundabout, the attempt has been made to reduce what we call geometric delay. So in other words, if there's nothing else there, we reduce to a minimum the speed reduction that a vehicle has to undertake in negotiating the roundabout. Whereas a compact roundabout you can regard as effectively traffic calming at a junction. So you come on, you sort of turn left onto the roundabout, and then you turn left off the roundabout again once you've been around it, rather than the sort of more sweeping movement that you can make an English-style roundabout, which I actually call British roundabout. And I had a big discussion with somebody about whether it should be called English or British, but anyway, there we go. We ended up with British. I cannot see that we will change all of our roundabouts in the UK to compact, but there are certainly a large number in urban areas that ought to be changed, and I think Cambridge is leading the way on that. So, yeah.
I would say Sunderland led the way on that in 1937, in that they had a cycle track around a roundabout, and it's still there. So in my research, that was one of the ones that I videoed for my Kickstarter project. So I showed myself coming round the protected cycle track, coming round a roundabout. So we have been. Okay, I agree with what you're saying there about, we shouldn't call it Dutch style roundabout, but if we are going to call it a Dutch style roundabout, and I am just going to, then it's not something that we can't design in the UK, or have only just started to design in the UK. We did design in the UK many, many years ago. So all of these things are absolutely possible because we've definitely done them before.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay, Chapter 11, Carriageway and Cycle Track Crossings.
So yes, so this picks up any sort of crossing of the carriageway which hasn't been picked up before. So, signal roundabout and so on and so forth. And it, broadly speaking, is dealing with signalised crossings or zebra crossings. So that's a zebra crossing of a pedestrian route crossing a cycle route. And there are some good examples now at bus stop bypasses up and down the UK. We're beginning to be more familiar with the fact that at junctions where there are pedestrians and cyclists, we can't just let them organise themselves. It's much better to put in the traffic engineering so that there's some understood level of priority one way or the other. So that's, broadly speaking, what Chapter 11 is all about.
And then Chapter 12, and I see another one of these critical chapters. Cycle parking it's a critical issue. You absolutely are not going to go into the centre of town if you can't lock your bike up somewhere secure. So
absolutely right. Yeah. Now I'll let you into a secret. Cycle parking bores me rigid, but it has to be there. And I suspect that's part of the problem, isn't it? I mean, it's pretty straight. Why does it bore me rigid? Well, it's pretty damn straightforward, isn't it? You provide a Sheffield stand, problem solved. There's a bit more to it than that, and I go into that in the chapter. But and again, I think this is something that I've picked up from a tweet that somebody made about the book. But fundamentally, replacing car parks with cycle parking fundamentally increases the capacity of your high street. That's it, basically.
Okay.
We need to provide it. We have to provide it. Let's just get on with it and do it.
And the Dutch provide it in spades, of course, with multi-layers and 3,000 bikes and stuff like that. Okay. Chapter 13, Modelling and Auditing in Design.
Okay, so this comes back to now. Note that in design, it's potentially subtle. There are issues in this chapter which are about methodologies for assisting designers, which are different than some of the methodologies that I've already talked about in Chapter 2 in terms of planning for cycling. So there's a sort of slightly different emphasis. And the modelling I'm talking about is operational appraisal modelling using things like microsimulation modelling, which is a very common method for producing models, sort of visualizations of things like junctions to show to policymakers about what a future scheme might look like. There are some specific issues about how you would simulate cycle traffic in microsimulation. A lot of work has been done on that, and I'm summarising some of that to assist people in the process of appropriate microsimulation modelling of cycle traffic. And then I think beyond that, there are also, we will operationally appraise traffic engineering schemes, and many times we're wanting to understand the level of kind of efficiency and efficacy and so on and so forth of cycle traffic. And there have been legion, and I list them in the book, methodologies for auditing and reviewing and so on and so forth. But we are now moving towards a system which is contained in the local cycling and walking infrastructure plan methodology. We're sort of stripped. Sometimes these methodologies become enormously detailed. But then they become so detailed that nobody uses them, and so it's getting the right balance. And the book sort of leads towards the current state of the art in where that is.
Okay, now I'm going to go back to the front cover here, because the subhead, it's Designing for Cycle Traffic is the title, but then the subhead is International Principles and Practice. So far what we've been talking about is very much the British cycle infrastructure, but here we have in Chapter 14 we have cycle provision in developing nations. So why is that in there, and what's that about?
Okay, can I just sort of slightly correct that? I think what I am hoping I've done, maybe it's not come across as strongly as it should based on your comment, but I'm strongly basing everything that I've written so far in North American guidance, Dutch guidance, Danish guidance, and UK guidance. And I'm comparing and contrasting and evaluating all four of those. And that's what's happened throughout the book. Where I have had a particular UK focus has been solely on issues to do with legal issues and planning issues, particularly. So other than that, all of those engineering principles and practices are drawn from those four countries. So what chapter 14 is doing is looking separately at developing nation issues, and I think the title for that is actually, it's been suggested to me, not quite right. We normally use the word low resource country instead of developing nation. I've been looking at design guidance which the World Bank and others have put together for particularly Africa and Southeast Asia, and the issues in each of those two continents are rather different. African cities tend to be car dominated. They tend to, but Africa is far less well developed than Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia much more interesting in the sense that you have the bicycle, you have the rickshaw, and so on and so forth. So there's a real mix of traffic on Southeast Asian roads and safety issues as a consequence of that. So there's some very distinct problems and issues that each of those different continents has, but fundamentally the principles, remain the same. And I have a section on there which just reiterate that and also identify differences where there are differences.
Okay, chapter 15, and that's before we get into the bibliography and the appendices. So chapter 15 is innovation in provision for cycle traffic.
Yeah. Okay, so this is the recognition that we are on a trajectory, and I sort of make the point that sometimes innovation for one party, one city, one country is actually standard practice somewhere else. And I think hopefully the book will help level up every place to an understanding of what the current state of the art is. Having said that, I do point out, where there are differences, what some of those important differences are. I talked about stricter liability, for example, where in Northern Europe you are strictly liable as the driver of a more dangerous machine to anybody who is more vulnerable than you are.
And as a cyclist, you're also ditto for the pedestrian.
Absolutely, and I make that point. Yeah, that's right. And then I talk about developments in planning and innovations in infrastructure. So some of the more experimental developments that are going on in some parts of Northern Europe, I put into this chapter. Things like, for example, turning on a red aspect, which is now possible in some parts of France. Mm-hmm. Issues, and it's controversial for the UK, but not for much of Europe, issues of turning into a side road, but then at signals, but then giving way to pedestrians who are crossing. Issues like that. And then some more fun issues as well, like heated cycle tracks, which mean that they never get frosted in the winter.
And then you mentioned driverless cars as well.
Yes, indeed. And we've had a very extensive stream of work in our university here on investigating connected and autonomous vehicles. And one of the trials that we have done has very importantly looked at the interaction between pedestrians and autonomous vehicles, and also cyclists and autonomous vehicles. Broadly speaking, what we found is that there is sort of no difference in opinion or approach, as it were, of the human. However, and I need to be quite careful how I say this, but I mean, broadly speaking, my take on autonomous vehicles is that the tech industry and also politicians are utterly sold on them. Mm-hmm. I think the transport planning industry is only waking up to the issues that they create, and I think we need our profession, the transport planning profession, to do an awful lot more thinking and acting in this domain, because otherwise the politicians and the tech will begin to dominate. Just to give one small example there, I have heard it said by a techie person, something along the lines that, if the pedestrian were to want to step out, what we need to do is give them a device that tells them whether it's safe for them to do so. At which point I go, hang on, no, the public highway is a right of way for people. It's not a right of way for an autonomous vehicle. And just consider, I think this is a legal point actually, and I haven't had this resolved, but an autonomous vehicle without anybody in, I'm not entirely sure has a legal right to use the highway, because the right is enshrined for people. Mm-hmm. What I'm trying to say is there's an awful lot more thinking got to take place before we can begin to properly introduce autonomous vehicles on the roads of the UK. And were we to do so, I would hope that they are then, and this absolutely needs to be the case, coded in such a way that they will behave appropriately. And if they behave appropriately, they will then have a significant moderating effect on any remaining human-driven motor traffic, I would.
Mm-hmm. Well, this podcast has certainly covered that many times.
Okay.
Putting beacons on bicycles and what have you, all sorts of huge issues coming up in the future there.
Should not be allowed. It should not even enter the domain of being discussed. Beacons on bicycles. It's just not. Yeah.
Well, it's where the bike industry is going. It's very much in cahoots with the car industry now in doing that very thing. So an enormous amount of US bike companies are in deep discussions with this. So, yeah, it is an issue I find very, very disturbing, to tell the truth.
Really worrying, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Right, so we then have, so that was chapter 15. So there are 15 chapters in this book. Then we have what I very rudely described before as gobbledygook. So you have the three appendices, which are the priority junction capacity calculations, signal control junction capacity calculations, and roundabout capacity calculations, and you have now put me dead to rights to say, no, these are incredibly critical for the reasons you gave before. So I do stand corrected there.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
And then, of course, that wonderful index. So, John, we have been through your book in some level of detail, but the book is so incredibly detailed, you have got to have your own copy. You can't just rely on an hour and a half discussion with you to get the full gamut of what's in here. So let's tell everybody where to get this book. Where can people order this book, John?
Yes. Now, if you Google Designing for Cycle Traffic ICE Publishing, you should come up with the URL of the shop that it's being sold in. The online ICE publishing shop.
So that's icebookshop.com. I can see from that cover. Okay, and is that the recommended, or is it going to be slightly cheaper somewhere else?
It's on offer at the moment, and I am not entirely sure, I have to say, of the publisher's intentions sort of going forward from here. But I don't know. I don't know how the book industry works in that regard, to be honest, Carlton. Whether do we not still have the standard net book agreement or whatever it is? I don't know.
Well,
maybe not. I don't know.
I mean, it's probably different for academic books. That, mind you, you're still getting lots of academic books on Amazon. So anyway, the place we should be telling people to go to is icebookshop.com, and it's currently on offer. And where can people get hold of you on social media, John? So what's your Twitter handle, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, at John Parkin 28 is Twitter, and then I'm not very active on Twitter, but my main method of communication is still old-fashioned email. So I will read out my email address. I'm very happy to get emails about any subject relating to cycling, and it's very easy. It's john.parkin@uwe.ac.uk.
Thank you very much, John, for talking us through your book, Designing for Cycle Traffic. It now will have absolute pride of place on my bookshop to be pulled out when I'm talking to shock jocks and other people who need to have fact,
Brilliant,
and expert opinions actually thrown at them. So this is a fantastic resource. That's what it is. It's a resource. Okay,
Indeed.
John, thank you very much. I know you've got a meeting to rush away to as a busy academic. Thank you ever so much for talking us through your book this morning.
That's fine. Can I just say thank you to you, Carlton, for offering me this opportunity? Very much appreciated.
Thanks to John Parkin there. And thanks to you for listening to show 199 of the Spokesmen Cycling Roundtable podcast. Please consider leaving a review for the show on iTunes. And you're always welcome, of course, to leave comments on the show website, which is spokesmen.com. Amazingly, this podcast was first narrowcasted way back in 2006. And the next show will be a celebration of all those 200, count them, 200 episodes. Meanwhile, get out there and ride.